everyday use.
In the title Custom and Vintage, people have tended to focus on the vintage aspect, which really it isn't the case. Really the title reflects the equipment we used. We used custom built equipment and we used vintage equipment, which is I think what a lot of contemporary musicians use. You know, Eric Clapton and Slash and people like that, they use 1950s Stratocasters. They don't use brand new guitars straight off the production line, and so it isn't that it's a vintage product, it's just that that's what top session musicians use really. So that's where the title comes from. And with the studio gear as well, obviously studios, the most amazing sounding gear is the vintage gear, like the old Neve desks and the old Fairchild compressors and everything, and that's what people in studios use. They're not using brand new equipment all the time. And so we wanted to do a product that reflected that, and we wanted to do a product that had custom built drums and vintage drums as well as vintage recording equipment. And as we got into it, we did do a few sort of vintage techniques, like the heavily damped drums, but really it was from a point of view as well, that's what Beck would do, or that's what Massive Attack would do, or various DJs that were bringing out their own albums at the time. So it was never really let's do something that people who are into classic rock can use. It was really more influenced with what was going on at the end of the 90s on the contemporary scene really.
I was actually the photographer at these sessions because we didn't have a photographer coming in and doing the photography, so it was just amazing to take photos of these drums because they were so beautiful, and I mean, like the Ludwig Black Beauty from the 1920s and stuff like that. And I'm gonna actually frame these pictures and put them up on a wall because it's just, they're beautiful drums, period.
Vintage wise, this is one of the oldest drums in the library, but it's actually probably one of the most important drums for studio drummers, contemporary studio drummers. It's a Ludwig Black Beauty, and they had a very popular Ludwig Black Beauty model in the 1970s, which is a lot of studio drummers were using from that time until now. It's still a very popular drum. But then they made this model in the 1920s, and I kind of discovered it by accident. I've never really been that up on gear when in the larger part of my career. I was always just using the contemporary stuff that was around, and then somebody at some point said, oh, you ought to try a 1920s Black Beauty, they're phenomenal drums. And then I discovered that a lot of the top studio drummers owned one and used them a lot, and really it's become my most important drum in my drum arsenal. It's probably the best sounding snare drum I've got, and it's amazing to think that it was designed and built in the 1920s, but it really sounds amazing on contemporary loud rock and roll music. It's just an amazing drum, and they're very expensive actually, so I've only got this one. It would be nice to have them in different sizes. They do a deeper one, it would be phenomenal but they just come up very rarely, and I happened to snag this one at the beginning of the 90s, and I've just stuck with it because it's just phenomenal. Every time I go to a studio session I put this on the stand and the producer just says, yeah, that sounds right, and it's always my go-to drum. So yeah, this is the 1920s Ludwig Black Beauty that's in the drum library, and it's sort of, if you have it undamped, it has a sort of ring to it which a lot of drummers like, and it really sounds good in loud rock because the ring all gets sort of soaked up in the heavy guitars and stuff like that. But I kind of find, well, especially for the music that I tend to play, that the ring gets a bit annoying, so I usually tune it so that all the tension rods are evenly tuned, and then I usually try and back the ring off a little bit, and this is what we've done in the Custom and Vintage library. So there's a bit of a ring there, and then you know, there's nothing wrong. There's special products that you can buy, but there's nothing wrong with just a bit of sticky tape, and I just usually tear a bit off and try and position it away from where I'm going to be hitting the drum, and it's just backed it off a bit. Just backed it off, and that's what we've done with a lot of the snare drums in the Custom and Vintage libraries, just backed off the ring a bit, and it gives you a bit more of a retro sound, I suppose, but it's also my contemporary sound as well.
Chris has always had a fantastically good drum sound whenever I've worked with him, and I think the reason that is because he's got such a great selection of drums, and he likes to change them for every different song. So over a period of time he's built up a lot of kits. He's got a Noble Cooley kit that we use, which sounds very, very good. It's a bit more jazzy sounding possibly than the Ludwig kit, or the Camco kit, which is probably my favourite out of the ones we sampled. We also did a Gretsch kit and a Slingerland kit, which we kind of mic'd in an odd way, using we deadened the toms down on one particular set, just to give a kind of a very kind of funky 70s kind of sound.
Around the time that I first started working with Paul, I found out that Noble and Cooley were making a single-ply drum kit, and I thought this was really interesting because I just thought it would sing, and it would have a real depth to it, and it was something a bit different from all the other drums that were around at the time. So I ended up getting them to make me one of these single-ply drum kits, and this is one of the toms, and it's one of the drums that is sampled in Custom and Vintage. We actually sampled the same kit that was used on the McCartney tour. And the interesting thing about this is that this is the floor tom, in effect. This is the deepest tom. And because of this steam bending technology, you really can't steam bend anything deeper than this, which is about 7. This is 7 inches, and I think you can do about 8 or 9 these days, because it just doesn't work out. The wood cracks or it splits, or it's just very, very hard to do. So when they made this drum kit, all the toms were this shallow, and if I bring in a normal floor tom, which is also one of the ones we sampled for Custom and Vintage, this is the Gretsch 16-inch round badge floor tom, and this is the Noble and Cooley 16-inch floor tom, and as you can see, this is 16 inches deep and this is only 7 inches deep, but there isn't, I don't think, that much difference in the sound. I'll play it for you in a minute. I don't think there's that much difference in the sound, just because this is single ply and this is one of the multiple ply drums. And so this is kind of your custom built end of the library. This was made in 1989, and this was made vintage in about the late 1960s. And these are the drums that are highly prized by jazz drummers. They were just famously used by jazz musicians in the 1950s and 60s, Gretsch round badge kits, and they're called round badge because of the very famous round badge on the shell. And this is very much a contemporary style drum. Unfortunately, they were very expensive to make, and a lot of them failed in the manufacturing process because it's so difficult to do, and they just stopped making them. So there's very few kits like this around, and it was just great to be able to sample it for the Custom and Vintage library. So that's the Noble and Cooley Star Series drum kit and the Gretsch round badge drum kit. And one of the other innovations that came around the same time this kit was designed was the rims mounting system, which I've got on this drum. And this one's got legs, and the focus in the 80s, I suppose, was for very sustained drums and very clear, clean, sustaining drums. And this guy discovered that if you isolated the hardware from the drum, which normally they have like a big metal tom mount drilled into the drum, if you isolate the hardware, the drum has a cleaner fundamental tone that sustains for longer. So he's mounted the mechanism that holds the drum up when you want to play, which is like that. He's mounted that from the tuning lugs with rubber grommet kind of things, so it never really touches the shell of the drum, so the shell's able to sustain cleanly. And it's got a DW mount on it, but basically when I play the kit, it mounts onto a floor stand and hangs above the ground like that, instead of having legs touching the ground and leg mounts bolted onto the drum, which tends to kill the sustain of the drum. So a lot of my drums actually are mounted on this rims system. I just really like the way that they have a clean, sustaining tone, rather than the old style technology which was previous to the 80s, which was to drill holes into the shell and mount heavy bits of metal to hold them up around the kit.